So we're looking at on the radical turn in hermeneutics, and this is following up our last class when we just posed the question, what is hermeneutics about? And I don't know how helpful you found that, and it was sort of sketching the surface. I did try and give a broad overview. It was repeating what Bruns had said, but also giving my take on what hermeneutics was as opposed to interpretation. I didn't really get into that much, and maybe I should say a little bit more about that. It occurred to me afterwards, because interpretation of scripture, for instance, or of literature is as old as, forever. There are different views of interpretation, and it's a reading and understanding are two different things. I mean, you can teach a child to read, teach a child to understand involves more than grammar. It does involve logic and being able to make sense of things, but also even ways of expressing that are powerful as you get into the rhetoric. And all of those combined involves interpretation. You need to take account, and then there's ideas of genre and all that business. And that's all bound up in this word interpretation, or the Latin word interpretatio. And so there's nothing new there in that sense. That's an E. Whereas this word hermeneutics pops up in the really in the mid 18th century, I think, but it's particularly connected with Friedrich Schleiermacher, the German father of modern liberal theology. And there it seems to be doing something different, it seems to me. And the one thing which I should say, I don't want to reiterate what I said last time, but under Schleiermacher, all texts operate according to the same principles, more or less. So it's Schleiermacher's romantic hermeneutics are sometimes also called general or universal hermeneutics, in the sense that what he's saying about the text, the biblical text, is the same as what we would say about other texts. There's no distinction between secular texts and the Word of God. It's all the same texts, and you want to understand it through the same methodology, etc. Whereas prior to that, you would have a different sense of what you were doing when you were reading a biblical text as opposed to reading Dante or Shakespeare. It's not that there's no overlap, but there is a sort of a distinction insofar as the biblical text claims to be revealing God. So the authorship is different, and even the activity of reading is different, and the purposes are different, and all of those things are different. and so while there is overlap, at the same time there are clear, bright lines there, which are not going to allow you to conflate reading Dante with reading scripture. And if you read the authors before this era, they're all quite aware of that fact. So even Dante, when he talks about his mode of allegory, he says it's not the same as what the theologians mean by allegory. He is quite explicit about that. And that understanding of it's a different type of text and needs to be handled differently, that holds all the way until this period when the new term is used, hermeneutics. And this is why I find it slightly odd at Tyndale that we use the word hermeneutics for what is effectively exegesis, which with an additional consideration of genre, because it really fits more this rather than that. This is the fancy new word, but is actually dealing with something very different, with different presuppositions, with probably a different challenges that arise with it, whereas the old path of textual interpretation has always come by all Christians. They've always understood this, but I think there's something new here in hermeneutics. And that's what we tried to look at last time. What are the specific features of that? And the specific features are, at least in my understanding, the problem of understanding this word verstehen, in the light of what Immanuel Kant calls reason, Vernunft. And I suggested that Kant inverts what had previously been understood, which is that Verstehen was a higher faculty than Vernunft, understanding higher than reason. Understanding was the fixed points, the certainties upon which we can think and operate, and then applies it to new things. So there are certain understood things which we, to my mind, need to assume in order to be able to apply our reason. Whereas come Kant, he inverts those two, or rather, using his analogy, the Copernican turn, tries to see if we can suggest that the world conforms to our capacities to reason about it. And then he talks about the conditions of reasoning and so forth. And then what we verstehe, what we understand, comes on the basis of what we first reasoned about. So he gets rid of all understanding. So reason is the power to investigate all things, and we will only claim that we've understood something after reason has established it. But reason never establishes the existence of God. It never presupposes certain things. Because you can't find, again, there's no empirical basis for establishing God, because, of course, God is not an empirical object. So according to this shift, then we can't know God, we can't understand God, because reason is not able to establish it. And I would say, well, this is the problem of the Copernican turn, Kant's Copernican turn, rather than an actual problem of understanding. Or if it is a problem of understanding, it's only Kant's version of understanding that makes it problematic. And further to that, what seems to me to result from this shift is that the other thing that goes with it very soon, and this is theologically, there's a school in the 19th century called the death of God theology, is the death of man follows soon thereafter. Because we can't be certain that human nature is also a distinct, discrete type of being. So God's existence is questioned, but the very distinctiveness of human beings from other animals or even other objects also falls into question very quickly. So that's a product of this shift. And hermeneutics is dealing with the problem caused by the problematic Copernican turn. And it's trying to establish, what do we mean by understanding something in the light of what reasoning does? And they have a great deal of difficulty. How do we establish something as certain, having admitted the radical doubt that comes from demanding that everything conform to our capacities to reason about it? Because it's not just God that we have trouble with, we actually have trouble with almost anything, understanding anything, and then there's this hermeneutic circle that results. So this field, which comes in the 19th century, and you can date really to Schleiermacher, leads to a succession of other writers that are dealing with the same sorts of problems. It's a Kantian problem. And this is why I don't like to use the word hermeneutics for what is effectively just biblical exegesis or interpretation. You don't need to use the word, and you're confusing things, and you're better off making it clear that actually this is a new thing, and is it even a good idea for Christians to be regarding the Bible, for instance, as just another text? Because if you do, you run the risk of what Eagleton has just said about literature, that there is no such thing as literature. Well, how about the Bible? Well, there's no such thing. There's no authority in the text whatsoever, and we don't even know the authorship and all that sort of thing. And that's and I think what we can observe is a regular consequence of the hermeneutic approach. And I didn't get into this, but Schleiermacher says that we can know as well, if not better, than the original authors by inhabiting his thoughts with our own. That's the romantic hermeneutic. And on that basis, he thinks that that's what interpretation means. It means casting your mind into the original author's mind. And it's superior to his because he has this view of progression. But the reason it's progression is because although we understand what Paul is saying and we understand what Jesus is saying, we have the benefit of the distance of time and a different context, and we can see where they've made mistakes. And scientific progress has taken place, for example, or the development of new concepts that help us to look at things. So we actually understand better. Schleiermacher's not going to say this, and you probably won't get many Christians saying it, but the hermeneutic approach effectively leads us to say we can know better than Jesus knew because of historicality. Certainly better than Paul. You will see that regularly. And Paul and Peter and the apostles, they are the ones that chiefly get questioned. It takes a fair bit of daring to question Christ's word if you purport to be a Christian. But effectively, they're going in the same direction. And what the usual strategy will then be with Peter or Paul is that they were Palestinian Jews, right? And men at that, and so they were operating under certain social conditions which we no longer share, and therefore their comments on almost every issue are historically contingent and not eternally true. So they were true when they said them, and they had some relevance, but as time has gone by, the authority of those original proclamations has given way to a more authoritative understanding, which is that of the church. And the church is the modern reader, effectively, right? But it gets dismissed usually on the same lines that texts in our day get dismissed. So that seems to me the trajectory of hermeneutics. So even here when it's called hermeneutics ancient and modern, I don't like the term. It's accepting something that I think is up for dispute. Have these always remained the same thing? Are there not distinctions there? And I personally think that there are. So this is the colonizing of the past by the Romantic movement, and the assumption of the very thing which is in dispute, that it is valid, it does apply, and that the way we look at things is basically correct. At any rate, so is that clear at least? I mean, that's my understanding of it, that there is a great shift there that goes with the Romantic revolt against authority. It has a political context, the French Revolution. It also has a theological context, which is it's a response to rationalism of the Enlightenment, which is an intensely anti-Christian movement, and certainly disputes the authority of Scripture and would rather hold up the book of nature as a guide that we can look to. So like the deistic movement in general is going to look at the book of grace, yes, but also to look at the book of nature. There's nothing wrong with that per se, but in terms of empirical investigation, we can investigate the book of nature. We can't go back and investigate the source of the miracles because they're unique historical discrete events that took 2,000 years ago. We can't repeat them. So invariably, under this approach, those sorts of unique events get dismissed as unverifiable. They're not false, it's just we can't demonstrate them. So we can't say that they're true because they don't meet our, they lie outside of the realm of things that we investigate and can demonstrate to be true. Yes?
Well, yeah, or they take like a modern understanding. So like, for instance, Jonah and the big fish.
Yes.
Like, they'll be like, oh, it was obviously a whale, they just didn't call it a whale then, and stuff like that. And it's like, okay, maybe, but do we actually know that? Just as it's a big fish.
Right, or they will do what I mean, there's all sorts of strategies here, and these have been used historically with texts that the contemporary audience finds difficult with, which is to try and read it allegorically. So that story of Jonah and the whale, did Jonah really get swallowed up by a whale or a big fish, whatever? Or is this an allegory for something else.
Right.
And that process of allegorization is not one that begins with the biblical writers. It begins in ancient Greece, and I'll use this phrase. I don't know if euhemerization. This is what happened when the writers, say in the 4th century BC, were dealing with the Homeric text, and the problem that we talked about last time of the was it last time? Anyway, last time we talked about where authors read Homer's depiction of the gods, and the gods were immoral, right? And they found this embarrassing. Like, how can the gods possibly, if this is Plato's objection, the gods can't be like this. That's not how the gods operate. These cannot be gods. We can't call them that. Well, who are they then? Because we want to uphold something good about Homer's text. We think that it's helpful, powerful. On the other hand, this is not the portrait of the gods acting like bad men. We can't tolerate that. So what's going on? Who are these people that they're calling gods? Well, the euhemerization there is the theory that what we call Zeus and Venus and Aphrodite and Athena, whatever, these are actually people. And they've been mythologized into being gods. And we know that ancient kings often referred to themselves and gave themselves divine titles. And eventually that process has got to the point where the original historical figures have been forgotten, and now all we have left is the mythology that arises out of it. And so that's really what's going on, is a story of ancient, like a long, long lost history has now passed into myth. And so when they're talking about the gods, they're not really talking about the gods, they're talking about the great men and women of old in ancient history, now made into these wonderful stories. And let's just take them as that. Let's not present them as the gods. So it's Plato's approach, but it's a way of reading texts as well, things that you don't like about the text that are problematic for authoritative texts. Now, people will do this with scripture as well, then. And say for the book of Jonah. And that, I'm not saying that the book of Jonah is referring to a historical event, per se. I mean, I'm open to that, actually. I think it could be. And some will say absolutely not. I don't see the basis for doing that. It has the features of a story, but it also has the features of being a historical event, like it's talking about the Assyrian Empire. So that's a clear historical place, and Tarshish, where he's going to take the boat to, is a historical place. And the prophet Jonah, you can find him in other biblical text, so he sounds like a man, so it's situating it in a certain time and place, so that sounds like history to me. On the other hand, it does have features of a narrative where it's selecting its the items of the story in order to say something more than merely recounting a history. It's telling you something. But if you're going to euhemerize it, you might want to dispute that a whale could possibly swallow somebody and they would live for 3 days inside the whale. Because who can do such a thing? Like, can anyone survive for 3 days inside a whale? Well, I've heard people preaching, trying to demonstrate that it's possible to be alive for 3 days inside a whale. Okay. I find that a laudable aim in some ways, because they're trying to preserve the authority of the text in some way. But is that really the way it's meant to be read? Is that the important feature of it here? Can it not be truthful without getting into all that? Because anyway, as we know, Jesus himself cites that passage when he's talking about his death and resurrection, right? So he suggests that it's 3 days, right? Those aren't 3 periods or eras, but they're 3 days, and he'll be dead for 3 days and rise up, just like Jonah was in the belly of the whale. So anyway, but these are complicated texts, is what we're saying here, right? And they need to be dealt with in that way, and they can't be explained away, which is the euhemerization. That's what they do, right? And I would say that that's inadmissible for proper interpretation. You can't explain it away. You can't allegorize it. Whereas with Homer, I have no problem them doing that with Homer. Maybe Homer's was writing his story on the basis. Well, I don't think the gods existed. I dispute the authenticity of Zeus and Athena and so forth. So maybe these were ancient kings that became mythological figures, and now it's passed into some form as it is. Okay, can I do that with Scripture? No, I can't. So that's what I'm saying. There's a different category and there's a different understanding of what sort of text the Bible is. Whereas come hermeneutics, they're all just texts. And all of these strategies are admissible across the board. Anyway, so is that helpful at all? Anyway, it's helpful in the sense of that's where I think what I think is happening here. Now, he begins on the radical turn of hermeneutics. This is chapter 11 of Bruns's Hermeneutics, Ancient and Modern, with going, saying that there are multiple histories. And there are changes as it progresses. But when he says that, I think here he means it more in the sense that I have just given it. Since the 19th century, there have been different understandings of hermeneutics. He's not referring to what happened before that. So unlike his title, he's now talking very specifically about post-19th century hermeneutics and not everything that went before it. So he says that has multiple histories and so cannot be made into any one thing that begins and ends and suffers conceptual revolutions along the way. Although in our effort to make sense of hermeneutics, this is very much the sort of story we are apt to be looking for and inevitably come to rely on. This is why this course is so hard. Because first we're doing literary theory, literary criticism, and now we're bringing in hermeneutics, which is his own special sort of problem. And my problem is that I have to help you engage with what hermeneutics does to literary criticism, because it transforms it and moves it away from what we established last semester. And I think it does so because of the acceptance, as Eagleton said, that we all look at the world as the Romantics do. That was his claim. That's the way we see things. And he's speaking on behalf of I think he is speaking on behalf of the Academy in general. But I would say that this, I'm not with him on this. But I'm in a very small minority. But Gadamer, whom we are going to mention now, Hans-Georg Gadamer, is one of the writers within that tradition. So there are a series of them, roughly speaking. There's Schleiermacher. All this I review in the first chapter of my own book on Romantics, Hermeneutics, and the Crisis of the Human Sciences. And then there's Dilthey if you want. And then we'll come to, well, let's say Heidegger. And then we'll come to Gadamer. These are the four figures that I see there in general at any rate. And I put a dividing line between Heidegger and what comes before because I think even though Husserl slides in there as well, because post-Heidegger, there's that's where the radical shift begins. That's the linguistic turn or the ontological turn. So it's not just trying to recover the understanding, the problem of rational consciousness, verifying and solving the problems that Kant had created with his stupid Copernican turn. Because that's what it's trying to do before that. It's given Kant, how is it possible for us to verify our reasoning? Heidegger solves the problem of Kant by talking about language. And at that point, the radical turn begins. And it's trying to solve the problem of Schleiermacher and of Kant. And I don't think he solves the problem. Because to solve the problem would just be to go back to the previous thing. But he doesn't go back to what went before. He wants to look at how language discloses itself, and language gives us it. So I'll give you an illustration of what Heidegger does. There's this word that he uses. I'm sorry, I'm throwing all sorts of German at you here, but he talks about this German word Wahrheit, which is truth. If something is true, it's wahr. If it's the truth is Wahrheit. Okay. He says, where do we get this? So this is from a little booklet he calls Vom Wesen der Wahrheit. Never mind. This is just where I'm getting it from. And he talks about the Greek word for this, truth, which is aletheia. You know this from Greek? Your Greek class, you had enough Greek? If you didn't, I mean, you should. Like, that's a pretty basic Greek word and an important one for Christians, the aletheia, right? Now, Heidegger comes up with, and this is typical of Heidegger, with his own interpretation of where this word derived from. And he says that this A is an alpha privativum. It's the in the same sense that it is the absence of something. So if we say that somebody is apolitical, it's not that they're against politics. It's certainly not that they're political. It's that they have no involvement in political. Political has no interest for them. It's outside of that category. So I'm not a theist. I'm not an atheist. I'm an agnostic. But and some people will say, well, when I say I'm an atheist, I'm just saying I don't think we can possibly know theism. And that would be the Kantian position. He's an atheist in the sense that he thinks that those types of things that theology deals with, we can't possibly know. And that makes him an atheist. But he's not denying the existence of God. He's saying that nobody can possibly know it because it doesn't conform to his reasoning capacities, right? So that makes him. So that's what Heidegger says is happening here. This is the absence. It's not that. It is a lethe is the realm the river in the underworld where you forget, right? You dipped in the river Lethe and you forget your identity, and then you get reincarnated. It's one of the rivers that runs through Hades or the underworld, at any rate. And souls that spend a certain amount of time, 1,000 years in Plato, at the end of that period, they get dipped into the river Lethe. They forget their identity, their personal nature, and then they get reincarnated as something else. That's Plato's view. So there's a forgetfulness that goes with that, and or a hiddenness, and that's Heidegger's unique interpretation of what aletheia means. It is unverborgen. Height. That's one word actually, but I've just divided it in three, which means unhiddenness. So previously it was hidden, and now it's revealed. So it has the same sense that the Greek word apocalypse does then. Because Calypso, remember the goddess that hides Odysseus? She covers him, but nobody knows where he is. He's hidden from the world. And then he's revealed by the gods. The apo, he's taken out, he's pulled out. And apocalyptic, the genre is to reveal something that was previously hidden. This is what Heidegger says happens with the truth. Truth is the revelation or the removal from hiddenness of being. That's what the truth is. It's not conformity to or a correspondence theory of truth. This conforms to that, and therefore it's true. Right? I make a statement, so my colleagues would conform to the correspondence theory of truth. So if I say this is this, that's what it is. Because they're realists, ontological realists, right? If I say that this is a cup of coffee, that's because there's some truth content in that statement. It's not just the name I'm giving for it. There's therein, see this, it gets endlessly confusing, and the nominalist versus the realist and all that, but I'm saying something truthful about that statement, and my words correspond to the nature of the thing I'm naming. Whereas Heidegger, it wasn't there until language itself revealed what that thing was. It's almost a mystical way, and language itself reveals the nature of things. And until language does, we can't know it. And language is the vehicle for doing that. And for Heidegger, as he progresses in his philosophical career, he becomes more and more interested in what the poets do, because they use language in a very specific way that reveals something of the nature of reality that was previously hidden. So philosophy inclines in the direction of a species of investigating poetics. Is very different than the analytic philosophical tradition, which has no interest in poetics, right? Any rate, this is Heidegger's notion of what language does. So the phrase here, language is the house of being, is the house of being, in the sense that things don't exist until language reveals them for us. So the thought does not precede the word. The word precedes the thought. I can't think about something until I can say it. Now remember back what we said about Augustine. Augustine had this idea of a thought being expressed, articulated, and then the thought gets clothed in a word, and then we know it. But these are discrete things, a thought and a word. And they are related, but he certainly doesn't say that language precedes the thought or is dependent on the thought, or we can't think about it without having articulated it in words. But here that is what Heidegger is saying. The thinking comes after the words reveal it. Is that a help? Is that in any way conceptually helpful for seeing? No, still not. Well, compare and contrast that with Plato then. Plato is talking about justice. And C.S. Lewis will use the exact same illustration when he's talking in Mere Christianity. He'll say when a child says to another child, that's not fair. Both children understand what fairness is. And the child who says that's not fair expects the child to whom he's speaking to understand, and knows that the other child does understand fairness. In fact, they both do. So they're appealing to a category of that they both know intuitively. And that would be what I would say would be the forms of understanding. And what do they intuit? Justice. Whereas in Plato's Republic, that's precisely what is at issue. Is there such a thing as justice? Thrasymachus says, yes, there is. It's when the powerful and the rich get what they want. That's justice, which is a very cynical view, right? But what he's also with that, which is also to some degree correct, right? The powerful and the rich often get what the world, they manipulate and force the powers of the day to side with them. They've got power, privilege, etc. So that's just an empirical observation about how justice sometimes is misapplied and misrepresented. Plato is not having it, and he says that's not what justice is. There is such a thing as justice. And that's not it. Justice is in fact an idea that we all have. And it's a real thing. Now for Plato it's an idea. But now it's an intellectual thing before it's even expressed in words. Whereas for Heidegger, it's the other way around. The idea arises from the articulation, from the worldly experience of it. That's the radical turn. That's the linguistic turn. So it's a response to Plato as much as anything. I also think it's a response to Kant, as I've said. But it is to some degree speaking back to Plato, and Heidegger explicitly makes it so that he's taking on Plato and would rather hearken back to the pre-Socratics in his thinking. But anyway, Adam, did you?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think the approach of where it's necessary to have the word to first know, I think it eliminates any idea of mystery, because it kind of comes back to what you're saying, how children know something. They might not know exactly why they hold to that, but they still know it's true without even being able to know where it comes from per se.
It's a hard thing for adults to prove definitively, because when we're talking about, we're using words, right? And you need to use words to come to a common understanding there. But our idea is dependent on antecedent words, or is it the other way around? That's to some degree what's going on here, to my mind. And in Augustine, remember, these all pre-exist in the mind of God. And then they're articulated, and then in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word speaks things into being. Yes, but did they not pre-exist there in God's plan, in his conceptualization of what was going to happen, or just randomly he speaks, and then after the fact, ideas emerge out of it? And Augustine seems, first of all, to think that they are two discrete things, and that the thoughts are not dependent on the words. Because remember, Jesus remains God even when he becomes the Son, and there's a distinction there. And so all that language of Augustine that in his De Trinitate and in other areas is important for these sorts of discussions, I think. Anyway, yes?
I think the fact that a lot of people think in images rather than words shows that thoughts can't be dependent on words. Because then you think of an image.
Not all thoughts anyway,
yeah.
Right?
So that kind of just makes his point.
I think so, but those are images, those are vague to some degree, right?
Depends, yeah.
And we can grant that, but those might just be emotional or even biochemical responses, right? So I have
an idea for a piece of art or something. You don't think, oh, I will do this, 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 and this. You think of the image.
You think of the big picture. It's your imagination. Yeah, I think that's true. But even more than that, there are certain basic things, concepts of like justice, like Plato used, and goodness. And everyone knows what that is, and beauty. And so these are simple things that can't be reduced to something else, like God, divine simplicity. These things are there, and there's nothing behind them, or and after all, if you're going to hold on to the idea that there is a God, you have to hold to the idea that there's something that beyond our articulation that exists, right? So,
which is what I was getting at with the mystery aspect.
Right.
So if you have language always coming before the actual thought, you actually can't get to the.
You can never get there.
Yeah.
Right. But at the same time, acknowledging that there are ideas that God is beyond our comprehension or our articulation, our expression, doesn't mean that we can't know anything about him at all if he reveals himself, right? And that's precisely the distinct nature of Scripture. This isn't people speculating. These are people who have been inspired by God to write exactly what they've written. And therefore it has a certitude and an authority, which no human-authored document does. Right? So you will read it differently. Whereas the modern hermeneutics is trying to solve a very different problem. It has very different understandings. And post-Heidegger, it inverts the word thought process. So really I'm just repeating what I said last time, but I know how confusing last time was. So that's why we're coming back at it. Because I know it's not easy to get in one go, but I want you to be able to get that. We're going to do this for a while, actually. So if you didn't get it this time either, we're going to keep coming back to it, because I think the same thing is happening over and over. I'm sorry, it's trouble. But once you've established that this is what happens in the early 20th century, then we can see what later writers do as a consequence of that, which is they'll say, well, that brings into mind the issue of justice then. And if there isn't a concept of justice, which is generally true to all, which we have access to and the idea of which we all appeal to, and we have an intuitive sense of that, which is why we fight for it so vehemently and insist and have this strong, irrepressible feeling of an injustice that's done, is that the same thing as social justice? And the answer is no, it's not. Because it's, in the former case, it's a universally shared thing, and it is not dependent on your power or your privilege or your authority or any of the above. On the contrary, injustice is sensed by all. So when somebody who is in a position of power, privilege, or authority is accused of something falsely, they feel a very strong sense of injustice. Because a falsehood has been articulated, that's why. It's not disputing their power or their privilege or their authority in the situation. It is suggesting that the biggest issue is whether something's true or whether it's false. And if it's false, then it is fundamentally unjust. Right? So the later developments, which will admit ideas of social justice and admit the idea of language being the house of being, that means that particular people have their own language and their own house of being, and that house of being excludes others. Right? So this is the beginning of postmodernism, in other words, as we recognize it at any rate. Can you at least see that? Good. And then you can see what it was like before this, and that they had no such problems. So this is a problem created by the modern hermeneutic turn, and particularly post-Heidegger, in my view. And not just in my view, if you read the writers post-1960s, the philosophical figure, the main one for them, for at least the seminal thinkers, is Heidegger. They all point back to Heidegger. No accident. Which doesn't make Heidegger into, he's not going to endorse their conclusions per se, but I would regard his intellectual error leads to unintended consequences which are seriously problematic. The chapter itself, which we have, I looked back at it and I thought, well, I'm not sure, I don't like this chapter that much, but I'll go through it to some degree. But the issue now is not only, and so I'm going to go to the top of 214 here, when it comes to Schleiermacher, we have the issue of historicism here as well, which is also a 19th century movement, which is to see everything from the context of the present and look backwards. It's the view from today, looking back on the past, with the today being the authoritative moment. And if you were in the Lewis class that I just taught, and he got to the issue of, on the description of the eras, the ages, the times, the temporum, he was really dealing with the problem of history and historicism, because historicism says that what is at present is clear and rational and well known, whereas what lies in the deep, dark, distant past is just that. It's obscure, it's uncertain, and to some degree it's unknown and unknowable. And furthermore, we are not influenced by the past, we're emancipated from it by reasoning. So historicism and to some degree the Whig school of history go together, which sees human history as a ever increasing process of enlightenment and emancipation. And you will know that that's how anthropology sets itself up. So there are primitive societies in which they spoke to one another in grunts and cries, and eventually mythologized those. There were people that arose out of it and exerted their power. In the euhemerization, they became mythological figures. They were called gods. This was a sort of a quasi-religious age. Along came the philosophers, and they critiqued that these so-called gods could be gods. They were correct, the philosophers. the philosophers eventually gave way to the scientists, and the scientists investigated these things, and now we know that what the philosophers disputed, although the philosophers were part of the step towards the present, we know better than the philosophers do because we understand the way the world works now. We don't operate in a Ptolemaic cosmology, we have a Copernican one. We know that mathematics is the essential language of the way reality works, not words. Right? To repeat what? So somebody who's a scientist who uses mathematics to establish what reality is effectively more enlightened than somebody who uses words. That's what historicism does. His point here is that historicality, not history or historical transmission, is the true object, the Sache of hermeneutics. So the embeddedness of things in time. And Heidegger's work is called Time, Being in Time, Sein und Zeit. Sein, Being und Zeit, time. Temporality. And temporality is only overcome through, or rather it's revealed in the words. The embeddedness there of being in the world. And that happens, and so it's a gradual process of explication. Gosh, what a mess. It's going all over the place. I apologize. Just erase this. So for a certain period, and to a certain degree, we can understand well through language. This is the bottom of 214 now. So, and that's in the cases where things are univocal. There's no way of understanding things in different ways, more ways than one. So there's no possibility of allegory. There's no possibility of symbolic understanding. There's no problem of misunderstanding of translating from another language. So univocal meanings. These are traditional, and now these are what this man Dilthey calls Nacherleben. So in the situation where I can read another author's words and understand exactly what they meant because the situation is univocal and there can be no double meaning or misunderstanding. In those cases, we can Nacherleben. We can live after and experience exactly what the original author did in those instances. So it's a lived experience. And that's what the Schleiermachers, when he says we can know as well, if not better than the original author, it's only in those situations where it's univocal. But as soon as there's any ambiguity, or it could be understood in a different way, it stops being that way. And then he uses this. So this is now Derrida, who's a post-Heideggerian writer. He observes that Hermes, from which we get the word hermeneutics, Hermes is the messenger of the gods, right? He delivers messages from the gods to people. Zeus says, "You go tell Calypso to let him go." You know, Odysseus is supposed to get home. It's time. Tell the maiden to let him go. She's very upset about that. Okay, so Hermes is the messenger. But the problem with Hermes, as they note, and this annoys the heck out of me, to be honest, but Hermes is not just a messenger, he's also a thief. And he's also a bit of a fraud. And he's also a bit mischievous. He's a little bit like Puck. He gets involved with nymphs and so forth, and he also has his own agenda. So the messenger of the gods is not just a U.S. postal worker where he just delivers the mail, right? Because they've got Hermes with the wings on his feet, and so he delivers the mail. Yeah, but this mail deliverer isn't just a mail deliverer. He also does, there's ambiguity in what he does, and there are agendas there and so forth. Anyway, so Derrida calls this the postal service theory of hermeneutics. That is, that we just transmit it. So this is what the univocal theory of Nachtleben assumes, that all we do is we get the mail, and we read the mail, we understand everything, and there's no problem. But there is a problem if we understand the mail delivery process as the messenger can misrepresent what the god said. And Puck's a good illustration for that if you think about A Midsummer Night's Dream. He keeps screwing up what Oberon tells him to do. He says to daub the maiden's eyes, and she'll, when she wakes up, she'll fall in love with the first person she sees. Well, first person she sees is bottom. It's not Lysander or whatever. So all sorts of confusion can write. And he says this is true of communication then in general. So it's not just sending a univocal message. There are sometimes we need to read the context into it. And as soon as we admit that about language, the question then arises, at what point is it clear and distinct and univocal, and at what point is there a possibility of misunderstanding? And for Derrida, the deconstructionist, that is always the case, even in things which we think are clear and unambiguous. As in, don't touch that oven to a child. And then the child touches the oven and then burns her hand and then screams. And you say, why did you touch the oven? I told you not to touch the oven. And the child says something like, I didn't know you were commanding me not to do it now, or something. Or I was saying, my daughter has an extraordinary capacity for lawyering everything I say to her. It's quite alarming, to be honest, because I can think about myself and think, my goodness. So somebody can tell me to do this, and it's clear and it's unambiguous in my mind, but she is at least claiming in her mind that there was some ambiguity about what I said at that point. I told you to stay here and not go there, and then she goes there, and it's like, well, I was thinking that you were saying that for my brother who was also present, but it didn't apply to me, but I told you. Yes, I know, but I thought you were telling me because I was to restrain him, but not because I wasn't supposed to, whatever. That sort of thing, which is the endless ground of lawyers, right? Lawyers deal with exactly that sort of thing, context and that sort of thing. Anyway, he's observing that is true of all language. So language involves the context, and there's always a contextualization, and actually there's almost no cases where things are univocal and cannot be misunderstood. And that's the problem with hermeneutics. It's always revealing ambiguities and a lack of clarity. And failures. The message that was, I sent a mail to somebody the other side of Toronto, it ended up in Japan or something like that. Delivered to the wrong sender. It goes the wrong place. Or it's misread. All these things are possible. And so then comment on this. We know, or by now we ought to know, that Hermes was never simply our friendly postman, but the granddaddy of tricksters, which is true, by the way, in terms of the way he's presented in ancient mythology. A figure of anarchy or misrule, of thievery, treachery, and deceit. Someone always a little out of control, the bringer of truth, who doubles as the thief of reason, and who therefore leaves you in perpetual hesitation as to what you've just heard or said, written or read. In short, a polytropic figure, someone mischievous and untrustworthy, like the language we speak when we try to make sense of anything. This is not Hermes the friendly postman, but Hermes the many-sided, uncontainable, nocturnal transgressor. And I'm going to stop reading at that point because it gets quite rude. This is what he also does. You can read it for yourselves. I'm not going to read it out loud and have it recorded on YouTube because I'll get banned for the vulgarity. Anyway, but there's that aspect to it. So misunderstandings are always possible, and this is the point. So language now being the house of being, we don't get from language then what we would like, which is the thoughts which are submissible to logic and reason. right? So if language is the beginning of what is supposed to be then clear, distinct ideas and the logical, the laws of logic, we'll find that actually those are not possible, because language never allows for clear, distinct ideas like the laws of non-contradiction. There is no such categories as male and female, or night and day, or black and white, or whatever. There are shades and possibilities of misunderstanding there. That's the issue that arises out of this. So then logic becomes not impossible, more or less. Because actually when I said, don't do this, I wasn't saying because it's always wrong in every situation. Maybe it's right in some situations for my daughter to disobey and run across the road. What would those situations be? Her brother ran out in front of a car, and so she ran after him to grab him before he went out there. So she disobeyed because she was using her head and taking initiative and doing a good thing. So it was, the phrase was clear and unambiguous, and there was nothing wrong with it per se, but she decided not to do it for a good reason. All those things are possible here. And he's saying this is the problem of the Heideggerian turn. And Derrida will go on endlessly about this. And furthermore, he then will say that all language has always operated this way. Even things that are allegedly philosophically clear have always been questionable. So I'll give you an illustration, and this is one that Nietzsche observes. When Descartes says, "I think, therefore I am," the famous cogito ergo sum, right? I think, therefore I am. Did Descartes actually demonstrate clearly that he existed from this? Because he thinks he has. Nietzsche will say all he's demonstrated is that he's thinking. When he says cogito, I'm thinking, and then the ergo that follows it, he hasn't proved that he exists, he's just proved that he's thinking. Cogito ergo cogitans. Cogito, therefore I think, therefore I'm thinking. That's what you've done. But you haven't proved your own existence. You say you have because of the fact that you're thinking, but that doesn't prove existence. Anyway, that's Nietzsche's response to Descartes. So even that clear and distinct idea that Descartes has, which is the basis for other things, that subjective awareness of his own thoughts being indisputable to him, don't prove his existence to other people. Maybe not even to himself. Anyway, that's Nietzsche's response to that. So all that's demonstrating is that you are thinking. That's incontrovertible if you say, I think. But your existence is not a logical consequence of the fact that you're thinking. You may not accept that or not, but that's the take on it.
Yeah, it removes causality.
It does remove the causality. There's no ergo. You are thinking, there's no doubt about that, but you've not proved your existence thereby. Not indisputably. You might exist for sure, but it's not the ergo. You haven't quite got there yet. So even on the realm of your own existence, there's no certitude. That's the problem of the linguistic turn. Then, applying backwards, it can demonstrate nothing with certitude. And Derrida says this is true of all language, that the messages not only can get garbled, they're always being garbled. So I'll read from this. Or will I? No, it doesn't. Now for Heidegger wants to, he doesn't want to open the Pandora's box here of no possibility of understanding anything. For Heidegger, when we or rather Gadamer, Gadamer will follow on this and talk about listening to a text, that a classical text interprets itself if we attend to it carefully and we listen to it. So in that sense, he sounds like a new critic, or even like a Lutheran. So if we read and allow the text to speak to us and don't impose our own meaning on it, the text speaks in the same way Heidegger says that all language does. The Wahrheit is something that was hidden becomes disclosed to us. So there's an element of allowing a text to speak to us. And remember back in last semester when I talked about Luther, and that one chapter, that Scriptura is interpreter of itself. It's self-interpreting. And that's the sola Scriptura. The Word of God Himself speaks to us through the text. So we are not above the text. We are not imposing upon it historicality. We're not saying these are the words of Paul, and I need to contextualize, and I need to relativize, and I need to historicize and say that was 2,000 years ago. Let me think about all the reasons why this is not valid. Rather, I'm placing myself under the authority of the text, and the text is then speaking into me. And it's not that the church even defines what that is. The word itself tells me what it's saying. Anyway, so Gadamer fits more in that vein and is to some degree more helpful, I think. Although he still follows Heidegger, and I think this is why he remains problematic. But he's getting more in the direction of a more traditional understanding of what happens with when we read texts. But you know what, rather than get into all this, because I think it just goes in so many different directions, and it starts reading Derrida, and I think that's entirely unhelpful at this point because we haven't even got to Derrida. And deconstruction, and he talks about negative theology and so forth. I will get into that. And when we come to At War with the Word, the first chapter, he really engages with Derrida. It's a really good chapter. He calls it Derrida or Deity. I think you'll find it helpful. Your comments, your questions, or your thoughts arising out of this, because I don't think it's helpful for me to go further into that right now. I feel like I'm just taking a fire hose and shooting it at you, and it's like drowning you half the time. So why don't we stop just for a second and see it? Yes?
For Derrida and these kind of postmoderns, would they say that we create or construct the laws of logic? Is that what they're getting at?
No, it's just that language is never as unambiguous as we would like it to be. So it's never as univocal. So Schleiermacher assumes that you can just deliver the note, and it's rational, it's clear, we can read it, we can understand it, we can know as well as Paul the Apostle what he meant when he wrote that. That's all possible. So he's very, in some sense, very rational, Schleiermacher. Derrida is saying it's never the case. So it's not just that. There are those instances where that would be possible, but Derrida says even in those instances, there's always an element of ambiguity, and we can never nail it down like we would like to. And Derrida thinks that he's doing I'll get into what his logic and rationality is on that, but that's what his observation is. Actually, those situations almost never occur, that it can't be misunderstood. And not because we're trying to misunderstand it, but because language is never as clear as we would like it to be. And that's the nature of language, because it's temporal and it's contingent. It never leads to that realm of truth that is not subject to temporality and contingency. It's always contextualized. Is there a world in which you live as a finite being and I live that is not subject to space and time and misunderstanding and so forth as a consequence of that? And the answer is no. It's always possible. And that's what he regularly observes in his writing. Others will make other things of it. Say, well, and those who insist that it is clear and distinct and there can't be any ambiguity do so for the purposes of power. And they're not going to allow for misinterpretation or misunderstanding. And that's where Foucault then comes in to some degree. Says, yes, they say it is because of it supports their power and privilege and so forth. But you can go back to Eagleton, who we began with, and say even what we call literature then is actually not literature. It's the product of the ideology of a certain group. It doesn't have any actual existence. Anything could be literature. And so therefore Shakespeare, who we currently call literature, might conceivably not be literature down the road. They have different agendas. Heidegger or Derrida is not really interested in Marxism per se. He's more interested in he's more of a philosopher in the sense that he's teasing out the implications of Derrida and not applying them socially in the same way, whereas Foucault most certainly is. I don't know if that made any sense. A little bit? Okay. Anyone else? Even if it's not based on what I just said, thoughts on the course thus far, things that you think are troubling or unclear, and I have no doubt there are many, that I might be able to at least resolve. I'm hoping with the way that the texts are on the course that gaps start getting filled in and become clear. So, but maybe at this point I could point them out and then it would at least leave you with less of a feeling of drowning. Yes?
Just generally, I can see where the trajectory is going towards the idea of dissolving, like what is male, what is female, especially after today's lesson, and like things like that when we come into like later hermeneutics using like feminist hermeneutics.
Well, just think of the language and the male-female thing. There's talk of having these words being an identity being imposed upon you by calling you a male. So when mom has a baby, doctor delivers the baby, dad says, or the relatives out in the hallway, is it a boy or is it a girl? Doctor says, it's a boy. He looks there. That's just an observation of empirical. But in the understanding, if language is the revelation of who I am, nobody can declare externally who my identity is. Being declares who it is for me, and my being I declare for myself. Nobody can impose an identity upon me. I have personal autonomy, so behind this is also the Enlightenment postulate of human autonomy. Only I can declare who I am. And it's not something that can be observed from the outside. Right? It's something that my language, I will say who I am to you, and you will have to use the words that I use about myself, otherwise you are oppressing me. Again, it's rooted in this, first, the idea of autonomy from the Enlightenment, and then second, Heidegger's ontological turn, in which being is something disclosed by language, and particularly the language of the autonomous being. Right? So you can see at that point. But the problem with that is then that there is no common world of understanding at all. And all sorts of problems ensue from it. One of being simple incomprehensibility. Like, I'm a man, and now I'm not a man, just because I say so. And even if I want to say, okay, you are, does that mean that I can do whatever? So I'm a woman, now I can walk directly in the women's change rooms because I declare that I am. Well, you might even say, yes, I can't. Well, how about the women who are in there? They declare that they are the sorts of beings that don't accept people who don't look like women as women. Are they bigots? They are, according to this understanding, because they have a prejudice about identity related to what they see, as opposed to identity as opposed the way it's revealed in words. Right? So it's all about, now it becomes all about language and political correctness. Right? So the political correctness that arises out of this and is a real political reality, social reality in our day, is rooted in Heidegger's view of language, that linguistic turn. But it's also rooted in autonomy. So those are necessary steps along the way. Without any of them imagining that this could be the outcome. I don't think Kant, in his wildest dreams, can imagine this outcome. But I think it's a necessary intellectual step for that to be asserted. And likewise, modern feminist theory. So feminists, I just watched the Super Bowl. Well, okay. Halftime. This was a feminist assertion. Really? I thought I saw people with there was a pole. This is what strippers are on, right? And they're barely clad and they're shaking and so, okay. And I'm trying to think, so was this feminist or was it anti-feminist? Like just as a man, I'm confused here. Which one was that? Because it looked to me like exploitation. That's what it looks like. But I'm being told by the people that did it that it was an expression of their emancipation and that the fact that they're in charge of their bodies and so forth. Okay, so what is the determining factor for the rest of us that will well, that's how they see it. Okay. So it's a without commenting on the specifics there, it leads to all widespread disorientation. And there are no common categories. And I can't judge. So it has the effect of rendering people neutered in terms of their ability to act justly, because they're always waiting to hear what the just situation is. So am I being just by watching this and affirming it? Is that what justice is? Or is it by decrying it and saying that it's exploitative and it's inappropriate? Is that what justice is? Because I'm hearing conflicting opinions on that very fact. I mean, I know what I think and you know what you think. But the point is that we don't all come to the immediate common conclusion. And we can't. That's the bigger problem, because there's always areas where there's controversy and then you can discuss it and then you can come to a common conclusion. Here, I don't think it's possible. So it's a political problem, it's a social problem, it's a personal problem, and above all, it's a truth problem. And it's caused by a language shift. And the language shift is trying to solve the problem of romantic hermeneutics, which was the source of the problem to begin with. So all you have to do is step outside the romantic hermeneutics that created the problem to begin with to solve the loop and the endless crisis of self-legitimization. By the way, that was the title of my thesis, Romanticism and the Crisis of Self-Legitimation in something like that. But this, who am I? How do I know that I am who I am? It's this hermeneutic circle that never, you can't get out of the loop. Anyway, others? No, okay. So that was what, we'll leave it off with that today. We will come back to the topic. We'll certainly come back to Heidegger. I think next time we're looking at Terry Eagleton, and he is talking about structuralism and post-structuralism, and which is dealing with some of the similar sorts of things here. Post-structuralism arising out of the perceived problems with structuralism. It's not quite the same as Heidegger, because now we're going into linguistics. But there are certain commonalities there. And the chief commonality is that words for Saussure mean things in relation to other words. So black derives its meaning from being not white. It's not whiteness as a quality or as a universal. Likewise, justice. Justice means something because it's the opposite of injustice. So words derive their meaning from other words. Very much like Heidegger in that sense, right? And so the concepts arise out of the words and only from this interplay of so forth. But anyway, it's just another angle to nail down everything else we're observing in post-structuralism and contemporary identity theories of various sorts. Okay, so we'll pick it up then. Now, I said to you, by the way, for essays, you can write and I thought about this a little further, you can write a sort of book review of At War with the Word, or you can do an essay if you want, and I can give you some essay topics if you prefer. I think you find At War with, well, you're going to need to read At War with the World anyway, but I won't, on further thought, won't insist that you write the book review on that if you'd rather write an essay. So I'll stick the essay topics up right this week. Okay, or you can do a book review.